right, so longtime readers of the newsletter will know that I want to pile on with everyone else, kind of bashing social media these days. And in our current situation, I think that a lot of folks are really starting to realize that there's a pretty significant problem that we have with social media. And I might as well continue the pile on. Coincidentally, as I recently just signed up for Twitter again, which is pretty funny. But I do want to try to add a slightly different perspective to a lot of the criticisms that people have been making of social media platforms. So a lot of the standard criticisms have to do with things like the attention economy, which was highlighted aptly in the film The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which tens of millions, maybe I don't even remember the numbers of people who have watched at this point, right? So that's kind of entered the cultural discourse. People realize that there's some issues going on when essentially large networks are trading in the behavioral futures of hairless apes, that there may be some misaligned incentives there. From a political perspective, there's been a lot of criticism of things like filter bubbles, of people sort of being pulled into conspiracy rabbit holes, of polarization online. And I think that some of this stuff is a little bit misleading in terms of what actually happens. To be fair, a lot of the large social media companies and YouTube have actually made significant changes to their algorithms, to their recommendation protocols, et cetera, based upon a bunch of criticism that has been levied against them by people who are concerned with rabbit holes, filter bubbles, polarization, et cetera. People are very concerned about censorship, and that's an extremely topical situation right now. This is early January 2021, as people are flocking to encrypted messaging applications like Signal, like Telegram, based upon concerns about censorship on larger social media platforms. So there's all of these problems sort of percolating in the cultural collective consciousness, let's say. And I do have a lot of these same concerns. I think that most of these concerns are valid, although potentially some of them are overplayed in some aspects or mischaracterized. But that said, there's a lot of people who have very bad opinions of social media companies for a lot of different reasons. But I would like to try to zoom out a little bit and discuss this problem from a slightly different perspective. Actually, I think Tristan Harris, who is prominently featured in The Social Dilemma and has been making podcast appearances for years now, explaining some of the potential misaligned incentives and problems with the current social media ecosystem. So if you're not familiar with Tristan, I'd recommend searching out some of his interviews, or looking up his podcast, which is called Your Undivided Attention. There's some really great episodes on there. But he's used an analogy of something like climate change when discussing the problems of social media, right? That a bunch of different people may start to notice different problems, right? People may start to notice some instability in weather patterns. People may start to notice some problems with coral reefs. People may start to notice some changes in different ecosystems based upon increasing or decreasing rainfall. And that these problems may seem disconnected. But then when you zoom out and you're like, oh, there's this thing called climate change, and it essentially can cause all of these disparate effects based upon changes to the entire, let's just say, ecosystem as a whole, then that creates a more salient framework to think about some of these issues. And so I'd like to try to talk about some of the social media problems from a similar perspective, right? Because these issues of polarization, these issues of distraction, these issues of filter bubbles, of censorship, etc., those are all important. But I think the bigger thing that's potentially going on, which was hinted at on my podcast from a few months ago with Albert Cow, is really a speeding up and a hyperconnection of our information networks, right? And that seems to be the potential root of a lot of these problems. And so I recently used an analogy when discussing this issue, which I think someone else potentially used as well. So apologies to whomever originally used this for not crediting you for the insight to tie these pieces together. But it's sort of like a three-tier analogy. So we think about something like a ship, right? Like a tanker, an oil tanker. These ships are set up with compartments in the hull, right? So if part of the ship is breached, that water may flood in, but it's only going to stay in that specific compartment of the hull so that the ship doesn't sink, right? And even if the ship weren't going to sink, even if there were just some water, it could actually create a problem to get significant water into the ship as a whole, because it can just start to slosh around and destabilize the thing. So the engineering of ships is created in order to restrict the potential damage of some water getting into the hull. And when discussing the financial collapse in 2008, I wish I remembered the name of the documentary. I should have looked it up before I started recording this. But it was a documentary discussing some of the financial chicanery, tomfoolery, etc., that resulted in the 2008 financial crisis. And someone used a very compelling analogy of, we theoretically regulate financial markets to be something like a ship where there's different compartments. Something goes wrong in part of it, it may cause some serious problems, there may be a bunch of issues, but it should remain isolated to that specific aspect of the market. It shouldn't have the ability to start pulling down other aspects. And based upon some of the, again, misaligned incentives, fancy financial products, bad behavior, etc., that all of those pieces combined to result in a ship that we thought had been set up with clear compartments so that, something starts to leak. Okay, we got a problem, we can fix it. But instead, water starts rushing in, starts sloshing around throughout the entire financial system, and starts destabilizing and pulling down huge sectors of the entire system that should have been protected from something going awry like that. And I think that analogy is extremely appropriate when thinking about what's going on in our information economy as a whole, right? That we have these situations now based upon the hyperconnectivity of our networks and the fact that so many people are online who have, let's say, a pretty loose epistemic footing on what's going on. And so there's this ability for information to just kind of, dangerous information, bad information, et cetera, to flood in and then effectively start sloshing around in the bowels of our society and destabilizing things, right? That we don't have the protections that we used to have, just of people not being hyper-connected and able to sort of find whatever kooky ideas they want, which then result in, some pretty bizarre real world behaviors. And so it's not just this issue of the sloshing around of information in our information economy. I think that we also have a simultaneous eroding of trust in institutions, right? So I read a book called The Revolt of the Public a few months ago. It's been recommended several times to me. I've heard the author Martin Gurry on a few podcasts, and I found it extremely compelling. And a big part of his thesis is that the internet reduces trust in institutions. So as, a 16-year-old, 18-year-old, whatever, I was constantly frustrated with, let's call it a complacency of the people around me, right? I saw a lot of problems. I was very frustrated with a lot of government policy. I was very frustrated with what I considered to be unethical behavior from corporations. I was very frustrated with people not recycling in the lunchroom and would go around and pluck their recyclable goods out of the garbage can and place them in the recycling bin. Just a general, terror to be around was probably extremely self-righteous and argumentative and just full of bad ideas. I think my heart was in the right place. But my frustration at that time had to do with a lot of complacency. And I think that in 2021, we almost have the opposite problem where people are extremely hyper-aware of the failings of the institutions that they see as prestigious, right? That every time someone does something corrupt, they find out about it. It's shared on Facebook. It's shared on Twitter. They're more plugged into news on their phone. If you have an iPhone and you swipe left, you get to see constant failures of institutions, investigative journalism, et cetera, which on the surface seems like it's a good thing. But what actually ends up happening for a lot of people is that by seeing these failures from people who they assumed actually knew what was going on, they end up in a pretty difficult situation of being extremely low trust in society as a whole and extremely low trust in the institutions that are supposed to be keeping things together, right? And so I think that if you asked my 18-year-old self what would happen if people started to realize all the problems that were going on, I would say something like, oh, it would be fantastic. People would start to realize that they had power and that they would be able to fix all these issues and everything would move in a better direction. But what seems to happen instead, in a lot of cases, is not that people recognize problems and then come up with productive solutions for them. It seems that they instead lean further into tribal bonds, grandstanding, moralizing, and essentially, nihilism. So this loss of trust in institutions is partially caused by the internet, if you buy Gurry's thesis, which I really kind of do. And simultaneously, we have this sloshy, frothy, messy information ecosystem where ideas are getting dumped in and they're just creating tsunamis and turbulence and all kinds of stuff that just sort of destabilize the entire system. So those two pieces create a ratchet, right? So we talk about, Seth Godin actually talks about ratchets all the time in the positive sense for businesses. So if we think about someone creating content, let's say, right, which is something I've been thinking about a little bit, and there seems to be like a critical audience size where once you have a large enough audience, a lot of really positive things start to happen for you, right? You have enough people paying attention that you get consistent feedback on what's working and what's not working. You have enough people paying attention that they start to actually refer people to your content, whether it's a podcast, a newsletter, an Instagram account, whatever. They start to refer people at some sort of critical mass where you start to actually grow. And then once you start growing at a certain rate, then that growth rate can actually compound. And as these people start to pay attention, then as a content creator, you get more feedback. You can actually do more surveys of people. You can do things like, create products, etc., which then give those people a positive experience, which makes them more likely to refer. And all of these pieces create this positive ratchet where one good thing begets another, right? But we can have negative ratchets as well. And I think that we're seeing those two, the twin forces of reduced trust in institutions combined with this frothy information economy really creating some serious social problems, right? And to me, that seems like the real issue that we're experiencing from social media, not so much the distraction as much as I hate it, right? As much as I hate looking at social media, as much as I hate the dings on my phone, as much as I hate the notifications, that's an irritation, but that's not going to destabilize society as a whole. So lots of people have made comments like this, complaints like this in the past about things like the introduction of television, like the introduction of radio, like the introduction of the printing press, and we're still here, we're still fine. So I do think it's important to kind of address those ideas in the sense that, well, first of all, a lot of the critiques that were made of television and radio and the printing press ended up being correct, right? I mean, the printing press did in fact kick off, I don't remember how long all these religious wars lasted, but throughout Germany after the the introduction of the printing press and the spreading of certain religious pamphlets, we had a lot of people literally go to war over their religious beliefs. Radio, there's a fantastic documentary called Nuts about a fellow named John R. Brinkley, which, if you are not familiar with Mr. Brinkley, Dr. Brinkley, as it were, would be well worth your time to at least glance at this fellow's Wikipedia page. There might be some rhyming aspects of history there that could be surprising, right? This is a guy who, essentially conned hundreds, if not thousands, of men into allowing him to implant goat testicles into their bodies in order to cure impotence, and then simultaneously had a wildly popular radio program where he brought on country music stars and spread wild propaganda, managed to run for office with some success, although the powers that be disqualified him on a technicality. Just really, really wild stuff, and this all happened in the early 1900s. So, if you're not familiar with that story, I'd highly recommend checking it out, because I think that there's a lot to learn from the tendencies of certain types of people to take advantage of latent market forces, let's say. But the reality is, people have continued to exist. People have continued to be fine, even if a lot of these criticisms of new media and new mediums, television, radio, printing press, Photoshop, right? I don't know exactly when Photoshop started, but that's probably a salient example for a lot of the people listening, where at some point you developed an intuition for this is Photoshopped, right? You can sort of look at a picture and you're like, yeah, it's not real. But still, that is a thing that can create confusion for people, that slowing down videos of politicians to make them seem drunk, that fools a lot of people. Actually, I did hear an interesting tidbit on Tristan Harris's podcast about misinformation in photographs, and the most dangerous form of misinformation from a photographic perspective, according to the researcher who was being interviewed, was actually real photographs taken out of context, right? So that you could take a photo of an actual battle or an actual protest or an actual, scene of violence, and then say, hey, this is happening right now, and here's what the deal is. But just basically lie about what the photograph was of, and that seemed to be more destabilizing to people. You can see that on Twitter too. Anytime you look at a trending hashtag for some sort of news event, I can think of an example in Chicago this summer during the protests and the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. If you looked at Chicago protests or whatever on Twitter, you would see these massive marches that were occurring not in Chicago, and there were just people, potentially bot accounts, reposting old videos of protests in Hong Kong, right, and just saying that it was in Chicago. So that seems to be something that's a pretty effective tactic for creating some sort of confusion and potentially manipulating people. So, there is the possibility that we're right now in a challenging situation where people don't have, let's call it, a cultural immune system to the types of misinformation, to the dangers of rapidly spreading memes, to the tribalism, et cetera, that does pop up on social platforms. And maybe in the next 10 years, we'll just figure it out. It's much harder to fool someone with a photoshopped image currently than it was probably when Photoshop first came out. So I'm not willing to totally discount the possibility that we're experiencing something of a panic that is not called for, and that a lot of the forces that sort of regress us to the mean, let's call it, will just, restabilize our epistemic footing. But again, a lot of the criticisms of television have come to pass. Cable news is a massively polarizing force in the world. People are spending hours a day on television, watching television instead of doing things. If you buy Bob Putnam's thesis from Bowling Alone, again, which I partially do, the rise of television and commuting effectively eroded the social fabric that really created a lot of the social capital holding American society together. So the eroding trust in institutions potentially actually started with things like that. So, we do need to be aware that it's possible that a lot of the folks hammering social media are incorrect, that this isn't too different from previous instances of destabilizing information technology appearing. But it is also possible that there's just something different, and even that, the critics are right, but people will figure things out eventually. So all that said, I kind of want to circle back to the idea of the dangers of this information economy really just, again, sloshing around in people's brains. So I think the idea of filter bubbles is a little bit incorrect. I did have a conversation with my friend Joshua Becker on this podcast, actually earlier in 2020. It was right before the pandemic. I think that may have actually been one of the last live episodes I recorded before COVID started spreading rapidly in the U.S. Well, it was probably spreading rapidly at the time, but before people knew COVID was spreading rapidly in the U.S. And he has done some interesting research on polarization, partisanship, etc. And he's shown that, people do actually learn from each other in a positive way, even in a partisan context. And so I do think that some of the concerns about polarization and filter bubbles are a little bit overrated, and that it doesn't quite work that way, right? That people aren't just in these situations where they're only hearing things that they agree with. They actually probably are seeing a lot of stuff that they don't agree with, and then potentially a lot of the information that they're taking in some cases, I think, is potentially moving them more towards a let's call it realistic and correct view of the world. But what I do think happens, and this is difficult to really parse out, and I'd love to potentially dig more into the research on this, is that people actually end up sort of on slippery slopes into new identities. I think this is the actual danger of social media, and it's not a filter bubble. It's not misinformation. I think that the misinformation and the filter bubbles are actually a consequence of a new identity. And again, this is something that turns into a ratchet. So a ratchet in potentially the wrong direction, potentially in the right direction. I've experienced some of these dynamics myself as far as reading a ton of blogs that I think make my life better, listening to a bunch of podcasts that I think make my life better, and taking in a bunch of information that I think gives me a better and more accurate view of the world and is maybe totally wrong. And hopefully some folks listening to this can chime in with feedback on how incorrect I am about any of the things that I'm saying. But to kind of land this concept that I started, if we think about someone getting into a new type of music, we can potentially trace how that actually happens for them. I'm in a few extreme metal bands. I've been into abrasive music with harsh vocals for decades at this point, and the way that a lot of the way that a lot of people talk about someone getting into this kind of music is through gateway bands, right? So let's think about a group of people in the world, and they have no exposure to, let's call it, extreme metal, right? Some percentage of people in that group of unexposed people would at least be potentially interested in extreme metal. And a huge percentage of the people in that group have no interest in it whatsoever. So if we think about people getting into extreme metal, maybe we just play everyone in that group the most outrageous, aggressive, harsh version of extreme metal possible. Probably almost no one will actually like it. If they don't really hear any metal, no one in the group is going to like it. But if enough people in that group hear something that we could consider to be a gateway band, right? That if we think back to the early 90s, maybe we take a band like Korn that was extremely popular. I know Sepultura started to make some inroads into the mainstream around the same time, Pantera, etc. Metallica, obviously. So these bands could be considered gateway bands where they're a little bit more appealing to the mainstream, and some people start to like them. Then some percentage of those people who like the gateway band then start to like something a little bit more extreme. Maybe you like Korn, and then you listen to Sepultura, and then you go back and you listen to some of Sepultura's earlier records, and then you start listening to Obituary, who's on the same record label as Sepultura, right? And then at that point, it's like, oh, now you're in the underground scene. And then once you're in the underground scene, you're exposed to a whole new culture. You see people wearing their hair long. You see people wearing tight jeans with large white Nikes. You see people putting pins on denim jackets and large back patches. You see people getting tattoos. And so what starts to happen is you start to identify as a metalhead, and then you start to take on the various tropes of that identity, right? That includes the bands that you listen to. That includes the clothes that you wear, and then it also happens to include some of the politics of those bands. Right? A lot of those bands were sort of like an anti-authority, somewhat leftist, in some cases somewhat rightist, alternative political viewpoints, etc. And so once you start to adopt the identity of a metalhead, then you can enter something where you're speaking to a lot of other metalheads about a lot of bands that you should be listening to, and you start to adopt their cultural beliefs and their cultural tropes, like I said. So it's not necessarily that you're in a filter bubble, right? It's not like, oh, I'm in a filter bubble of metalheads and I'm only hearing about metal. You're still aware of the mainstream music that's on TV or on the radio. You might even like some of it. Maybe you were kind of into punk before you got into metal, and you might still listen to punk. Maybe you have eclectic music taste and you're still exploring different genres like jazz. Maybe you had parents who were into classic rock, and some of that stuff still resonates with you. So it's not necessarily a filter bubble, but it's a new identity along with the infrastructure to support that identity. And so when people are talking about filter bubbles, I think they're really missing the mark, because what seems to be happening to me is more so that people are exposed to identities to which they have some sort of latent attraction that they would not have otherwise been exposed to. And then that starts to pull people into some pretty dark and bizarre political places. And this isn't necessarily meant to be partisan, because I see this on the left and the right. I've seen a lot of people in the last, let's call it 5-ish years, who I think previously would have been somewhat politically disengaged, right? Maybe they would have had an opinion. Maybe they would have been somewhat disaffected. Maybe they would have had a bad attitude about politicians or banks or foreign wars or whatever, but they wouldn't have been super plugged in. They wouldn't have been activists posting online, and they wouldn't have, they probably would have had some confused ideas about what was going on from a policy perspective, but they wouldn't have necessarily had strong opinions based upon some pretty kooky ideas. But when these people do actually get plugged into these new political identities, right, when they get radicalized by some YouTube rabbit hole, or they start following certain accounts on Twitter, and then they start listening to certain podcasts, and then maybe they get added to certain group messages on encrypted messaging apps or what have you. It's sort of the equivalent of someone getting into heavy metal, someone getting into punk, someone getting into jazz, right? All of a sudden they have this new identity that they can try on. And that identity includes a lot of beliefs about the world that are, let's call it, loosely moored to reality. So the real danger here isn't even necessarily the algorithms themselves, right? The algorithm certainly has some problems. We've seen some of the issues of rabbit holes, and I know YouTube has done a lot to try to clean that up. We've seen some of the issues of clickbait headlines, and I know Facebook has done a lot to try to clean that up. We've seen some of the issues of relying on engagement metrics, since that incites polarization. We've seen Renee DiResta has talked about some of the issues of Facebook groups, where Facebook tried to drive more people into groups. So people are joining yoga mom group, and then they're getting recommended anti-vaxxer group. And then once they get recommended an anti-vaxxer group, they get recommended a QAnon group, right? And it just kind of quickly sends them into these different identities and these epistemic, I don't know what the right word is, epistemic mudslides, right? That just sort of take people from, relatively unplugged in attitude towards the world into being extremely plugged in, having an entirely new identity. And it's not a matter of exposing these folks to different information. It's a matter of them having adopted an identity that believes in certain things, right? It's not like metalheads wear jackets with patches on them because they're only exposed to people who wear jackets with patches on them. They wear jackets with patches on them because that's what metalheads do. So this hyperconnection of the information economy pulls more people with a latent tendency toward kooky beliefs into subcultures that then give them an identity of these kooky beliefs, and it kind of snowballs from there. So I think this all circles back to the hyperconnection of everyone into these new information systems. And then the other aspect of this ratchet that I think is one of the more dangerous pieces, and this is where I do think that the algorithm does have more blame in the situation, right, is that the internet creates an environment that is optimized to evolve memes, and I mean that in a broader sense, not just like a funny picture with text on it. The internet creates an environment in which memes can evolve to be sort of like apex predators for human cognition. So with the ability for something to spread extremely rapidly, with so many brains being plugged into it and acting so quickly to sort of upvote or downvote things with their attention, with their likes, with their clicks, etc., that we can get really, really fast iteration of ideas to be essentially optimized to take over our entire brains, right? So if we think about, we'll use a music analogy again, since that seems to be a comfortable place for me to try to tie big picture cultural issues into an understanding of dynamics in music. If we use something like K-pop, which I think is fascinating, and for those who aren't super familiar with K-pop, there's tons of groups out there that have tons of different members, and they create this really chaotic postmodern mishmash of a bunch of different genres, right? That if you listen to a K-pop song or watch the video, the videos are sleek, they're beautiful, they're extremely well produced, and it almost sounds like a Mr. Bungle song where you got, okay, here's like a super catchy hook, then here's a rapping part, then here's an EDM part, then this has like a weird metal mosh part, and then it goes into some ambient break, and then there's a super clean hook again, and then there's a part that sounds like pop punk, and it's really just basically every genre kind of slammed together into this fascinating package. And so this is something that seems strange to a music critic, right? This is something that seems strange to someone who's kind of like plugged into the ivory tower of music appreciation. But the reality is that people absolutely love it. And K-pop, as it stands, is actually strongly reminiscent of a bunch of early and mid 2000s Warped Tour bands, right? That this sort of chaotic mismatch of genres done not necessarily from a high art perspective as done by Mr. Bungle, but done from just sort of like someone who has a loose footing on what they should or shouldn't be doing in their music, was actually extremely popular amongst teenagers in the early 2000s. And it was almost completely ignored by music critics and the sort of like mainstream music consciousness as a whole, right? That if you go back to the days of MySpace and bands like Chiodos or Attack Attack, and you listen to that stuff, it's just Falling in Reverse, etc. You listen to that stuff, it's like, whoa, what in the world is actually going on here? And I remember listening to it and just like cracking up. I remember laughing so hard I was crying at how ridiculous I thought the songs were. And then you go and see these bands on Warped Tour, and there's just tens of thousands of people like obsessed with it. You know, if you check these bands' listeners on Spotify, there's millions and millions of people that are still listening to this stuff, right? It wasn't just sort of a disposable throwaway gimmick for them when they were 16 years old. It's like, this is music that is standing the test of time in terms of its ability to resonate with some aspect of people. And so essentially what I think we're seeing in something like K-pop is the ability of the internet to recognize these latent tendencies that are outside of institutional gatekeepers and create, again, apex predators of mimetic replication and latent market satisfaction that spread wildly and rapidly and activate huge percentages of the population that wouldn't necessarily be plugged into this stuff otherwise. And so we see very similar problems occurring in our information environment. We have, again, crazy mismatches of ideas that don't seem to make a whole bunch of sense, right? It's just sort of like a sampling of every conspiracy theory slammed together. We see samplings of pretty much every combination of wellness goop fluff plus anti-vaccine misinformation plus weird Kabbalah spirituality, and it's just sort of slammed together in some influencer package. And institutional gatekeepers are like, this is insane. This makes absolutely no sense at all. And this stuff is spreading rapidly. There's people with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of followers based upon promoting these kinds of ideas. And it enables this rapid evolution of what works and what doesn't work by millions of people participating in it. And the stuff that does work, that does tap into this latent idea market, will start essentially snowballing, right? And then once people realize that it's working, you have people with mental health problems who are participating in this, and you have flat out grifters who are participating, right? That there's people who are purposefully, cynically recognizing that there's an opportunity for them to develop a name for themselves, or who just kind of like stirring the pot and having some fun, creating, disinformation, misinformation, etc. And they're jumping into the game and just creating dozens of Twitter accounts and seeing which ones start to catch on, and then doubling down on those. And so this rapid iteration and evolution of mimetic concepts in a non-institutionally mediated information environment creates, weaponized mind viruses that are capable of spreading rapidly through the uncompartmentalized information ecosystem and pulling otherwise normal people down an identity slip and slide, where all of a sudden they're at the bottom and they've developed some totally alternate belief system of how the world works that's essentially alienating them from their friends and family, and causes them to double down and really lean into their new identity, whether that's as some sort of conspiracy theorist, some sort of political contrarian, some sort of argumentative person who's lashing out constantly and taking people to task for perceived injustices, right? All of these behaviors that are extreme and potentially destabilizing and not terribly helpful are a consequence of the situation. So, all that to say, I think a lot of people recognize that there's a problem with social media, that we have issues, and that this is creating a situation that most of us don't want to be in, right? A lot of us have pretty bad relationships with social media. It doesn't feel good to be on it. It pulls at our attention, and it creates a lot of outrage. And people don't necessarily agree on what those problems are. They don't necessarily agree on what should be done about those problems, but almost everyone recognizes that there's a problem. And for anyone who listens to this, I'd be curious to see if this kind of zoomed out perspective potentially contextualizes some of those other problems and makes it not just about polarization, not just about the attention economy, not just about surveillance capitalism, not just about censorship, not just about potential dangers and needs for government regulation, but the reality of figuring out how human beings are going to be able to coexist in a world where we have this direct pipeline into each other's brains without gatekeepers mediating what type of information is traveling on those pipelines. Very, very fascinating times. So, all that said, I did recently reactivate my Twitter account, and I think the only practical recommendation I have for myself is that maybe I'll start tweeting again. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all of the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.